Hello class, in this video I want to return to the Kantian approach to ethics and specifically his response to the amoralist challenge. I know I've talked about this in class, but I want to return to it. It's an important step in understanding the two different formulations that Kant gives of the moral law. The first has to do with universalizability and consistency. And the second formulation of the moral law has to do with autonomy or freedom. And so to understand how Kant moves from the first formulation to the second formulation, and the relationship between acting consistently and acting autonomously or freely, and what both of these have to do with morality, I think the best way to understand that connection is to look at the amoralist challenge, right? And look at Kant's reply to that challenge. So that's a lot. Let's look at the notes that I shared with you. So remember, this is the amoralist challenge. This is an argument that someone makes, call that person the amoralist. And the conclusion of that argument is supposed to be that it's perfectly rational for people to violate their moral duty. That's the number 5. There is the conclusion. It's a challenge because it suggests that we have no reason to act morally all the time. And sometimes we have reason to go against our moral duty. Right? And so the challenge is to explain why we should be moral under all circumstances, or why we don't have a reason to violate our moral duty, because it looks like sometimes we do, the amoralist would say. So the argument is that, look, people have a reason to do something only if doing it will get them what they care about. That's the first premise. Well, doing your moral duty sometimes fails to get people what they care about. That's the second premise, which is certainly true. I don't think anyone would dispute that. Sometimes telling the truth or acting courageously, keeping your promise, fails to get you what you care about. Sometimes it conflicts with your self-interest. Therefore, people sometimes lack any reason to do their moral duty. That would follow from the first two premises. But if people lack any reason to do their moral duty, at least sometimes, then violating their moral duty can be perfectly rational. And so we get the conclusion that it can be perfectly rational for people to violate their moral duty. There may be various arguments you can make against acting immorally, but the amoralist would say that it's not irrational to act immorally, because sometimes acting against your moral duty gets you what you want. Okay, so look, as I tried to put it before, the question really here to the amoralist is, do I really get to opt out of this game? If we think of morality as a kind of game, do I get to opt out of it? Do I get to play by my own rules? Is it rational to do that? Is the psychopath perfectly rational? Okay, so here's Kant's reply as Schaefer-Landau sees it, starting with the premise that if you are rational, you are consistent. If you are acting rationally, then you are acting consistently. You are acting in a way that doesn't sort of involve some kind of contradiction. If you are consistent, then you are obeying the principle of universalizability. And if you obey the principle of universalizability, then you act morally. That's Kant's argument, right? That if I'm acting on a principle that I could universalize, that I could want others to act on, then not only am I acting consistently, but I'm acting morally. They mean the same thing. Kant is at least trying to argue that they come to the same thing. So if you're rational, then you're acting on a principle of universalizability, a consistent principle. And that's just what it means to act morally. So if you're rational, you're acting morally. From which it follows that if you're acting immorally, then you're acting irrationally. You're doing something inconsistent. You're acting on a principle that couldn't be universalized. Okay, so that's Kant's argument in brief. I think the weakest premise seems to be number 3. You might object to all 3 of the first 3, right? You might say that there are ways of being rational without being consistent. that sometimes it's rational to do something inconsistent, to go against your principles. Right? Consistency is not the measure of rationality. That's a harder argument to make, but you might argue that consistency cannot be captured by the principle of universalizability, that I could be acting consistently without acting on a principle that I could universalize. So that you might object to that interpretation of consistency. But it seems like the weakest premise is the third one, that obeying a principle of universalizability has the consequence that you are acting morally, or that it comes to the same thing. That every time you obey a principle of universalizability, you are acting morally, or every time you are acting perfectly consistently, you are acting morally, or in a way that your moral duty permits. That seems problematic, and so Schaefer-Landau gives the example of the fanatic who's obsessed with taking care of his lawn, or the fanatic who is obsessed with racial purity. Right? He gives those two examples, and it seems like both fanatics are acting on potentially consistent or universalizable principles. You could look at the examples in chapter 11 of Schaefer-Landau to see if you agree. But he's trying to think of an example of someone who is fanatically devoted to a single-mindedly and fanatically devoted to a purpose, and will do everything that in his power to accomplish that end or to achieve that purpose. But where he's acting on a perfectly consistent principle, right? One that could be universalized. But yet, because the purpose is an evil purpose, we would not say that he's acting morally, even though he's acting perfectly consistently. That's the problem. And so this is what motivates the move from the principle of universalizability, which is Kant's first formulation of the moral law, right? Act only on maxims that you could want to be a universal law for everyone. Or act only on maxims or policies that you could rationally want everyone else to act on. Right? That's a principle of consistency, right? That's Kant's first formulation of the categorical imperative that we see in, if you're looking at the Kant text, right? We see that in the Kant reading from the Ethical Life. That's on page 111. I ought never to act except in such a way that I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law. That's his first formulation of the moral law, right? Okay, but it seems like I can act in accordance with and out of respect for that law without acting morally. The fanatic seems to be acting on a principle that he could also will that should become a universal law, and yet he's not acting morally. He's violating his moral duty in some way. At least that's the point that Schaefer-Landau makes. And so this motivates kind of the Kantian concern for humanity and the principle of humanity. Always treat a human being, yourself included, as an end and never as a mere means to your end. And so here we are on page 183. So this brings in the idea of autonomy or freedom, free will. Always respect the autonomy or the free will of a person. And so I'm going to pause here and we'll pick up in the next video.